Welcome back to Unleash Your Amazing Leadership. Today, my special guest is Clayton Funk. He's the founder and managing director of Signal Strength Advisors, a boutique investment banking firm specializing in digital infrastructure, including wireless towers, in-building wireless, and small cell networks. With nearly 30 years of experience and more than 225 completed transactions totaling over 5 billion. Clayton is known for his deep industry expertise, strategic insight, and relationship-driven approach. Based in Clearwater, Florida, is what LinkedIn said. Okay. He's a dedicated father of two and believes that great leadership starts with clarity, integrity, and long-term vision. Welcome.
Great. Thank you very much, Tammy.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I'm excited to chat and to hear about your thoughts on leadership.
Yeah, no, obviously I've admired your work and the like what you've done on LinkedIn, and certainly appreciate the opportunity to contribute what I can.
Love it. So you've worked in high stake deals for decades. When did you first realize that relationships matter more than tactics or technical skills?
Yeah, I think pretty early on, and I say that because when I came into the business, I did not have a traditional finance and investment banking background that you would typically see for people in investment banking. I came from a non-for-profit, and what I started realizing is that as I'm pitching clients on hiring me, they didn't care how well I could do a spreadsheet. They weren't asking me to somehow prove my financial prowess or expertise. It was more about, instilling confidence that I could do a great job for them and building on the relationship. And so, I think that that was pretty evident early on that, the relationships matter. The clients have to trust you, and you can develop the financial skills. You can kind of learn that, et cetera. But being able to gain the trust of people, and I will say this a lot, instill confidence in them that you're the right person for the job, it's just infinitely more important. And I say this because there was absolutely a time very early in my career I had imposter syndrome. And here I am, not have gone to an Ivy League for college and university, and not having worked on Wall Street, and yet I'm going up against some men and women who clearly had those credentials.
Mm.
What I started realizing is I'm beating them out on deals because it was about relationships, and again, not about really nothing else. I mean, I never went to a pitch where somebody said, "Hey, put a spreadsheet up on a projector and walk me through the analysis." It was all more about, "Hey, can I trust you, and do I like you, and do I want to work with you?"
Yes, I think that trust and likability can get us really far, and those skills can be taught. But a lot of times, I know that whenever people are looking for new roles, you know, the ad or the help wanted thing might be like, okay, you have to have these credentials, and it's not like, hey, are you a good human?
Yeah, no, I get it, and I founded my firm now about 5 or 6 months ago, and that certainly, I like to say there's certain screening criteria. So for example, at the end of the day, you want to hire good people. You want to hire people that will be fit and a good human being, for lack of a better way of putting it, right? And yet at the same point, sometimes I know that firms like myself, but certainly larger ones, do have a certain technical sort of gatekeeping issue, right? And I think that's probably just a way to separate, candidates from one another, because at the end of the day, you probably do save yourself a lot of time and headache if they have the technical skills,
Yeah.
but it's also a benefit when you can combine the technical skills and then the strength of a personality and a good person.
Yeah, I think that they're both important. Yeah. So, in your experience, what do leaders often get wrong when they're too heavily focused on strategy and not enough on trust?
Um, Yeah, that's a good question because I liken it. I've had the opportunity to be a CEO for a whopping 6 months. So I think more about my clients who are CEO, clients of mine, friends of mine who are CEOs, and probably what's worked for them and what hasn't worked for them.
Mhm.
I would say, there is a fine line between a lot of entrepreneurs and CEOs between trusting somebody else to do it and just doing it yourself. And
Mm,
I would say, a strength of a CEO or a leader is learning how to trust others and enabling them to do their jobs, which empowers them and hopefully instills confidence in them while also freeing you up. I mean, if you're trying to do everything, then you're not going to do really anything well. And I know there's some sort of phrase about that that I would butcher if I tried to repeat it, but I see it time and time again. So friends of mine who end up being CEOs and we'll have conversations about what's working for them and what's not working for them. The ones that surround themselves by good people,
mhm.
trust them to do their jobs, enable them to do their jobs, and then let them stub their toe from time to time, but ultimately that's a growth and learning opportunity. Those have been the ones that I think they're very successful, but they've also got a better life balance versus trying to do everything on their own.
Yeah, I think that sometimes leaders get caught up in some micromanagement of people and because they think that they can do it, that their way is the only way.
Yeah.
And that ends up really kind of chasing the really good, talented people away because they don't want to be, you know, micromanaged and looked over
Yeah.
their shoulder all the time.
Uh-huh. It's exactly it.
So, can you share an example where a strong relationship made a difference to a deal or a decision that tactics alone couldn't solve?
Yeah. I think in a lot of times the transactions that I'm able to work on are very personal for some of the leadership. So let's just say I'm working more with an entrepreneur-led deal, company, transaction where it's very meaningful to that person, and and maybe they don't have many other decision makers, right? It's about them. And what I've seen a lot of times is, because it's such a significant transaction for themselves, that they tend in some ways, they start getting pretty nervous, right? I mean, because they're like, wait a minute, this is really important and I don't want to mess this up, and I want to make sure this is perfect because my gosh, if this doesn't go through, I'm not going to, realize the financial goals that I've set for myself or the success that I've set for myself. And so, there's a lot of hand holding that kind of comes into this job that I've realized that I frankly like a lot because it's again building that trust between a client and myself, and that's where it comes, I think, to your question. It's more about, hey, let's talk about this on a personal level and how we're going to get through this, and versus some sort of tactical or technical sort of solution to it. And I would say that's even kind of in say negotiating style too, where my gosh, Tammy, how many like courses and classes and seminars are there in negotiating when sometimes just being a real person and
Mm,
genuine, and not trying to go in with some agenda or whatever is the much better way to frankly get the result that everybody wants versus somehow feeling like, well, I've got to do this negotiation tactic and this and this and that. So that's
mm.
kind of what pops to mind, I think, with your question.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest skills to develop is listening. The whole two ears and one mouth for a
Yeah,
reason.
yeah, yeah,
People,
totally. And I think sometimes, I've had it a lot of times where, to your point, I get it actually having been a partner in a firm where we sold to another organization. You know,
mm,
you do that allowed even kind of more empathy, and understanding of what an entrepreneur goes through when they are working on probably the biggest deal they've ever had. And I say that because you hear that a lot in real estate, right? That's the biggest transaction most people have, and that's pretty true because not a lot of people own their companies to sell it.
right?
But I hear that from friends of mine who are realtors all the time that they're part therapist while also being part, business person.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and calming those nerves, that takes a relationship, that takes trust and the ability to really listen to what they need
Yeah.
in the moment.
Yeah, yeah, and I think whether again to your point, listening to them, really understanding where their fears are coming from, or their concerns, or even their excitement, right? I mean, sometimes it's not about the fear of the loss; it's the benefit of the gain, that kind of gets them maybe too worked up or whatever of not kind of seeing clearly, and being able to walk them through that after you really understand what's going on with them
Hmm.
uh, is pretty critical.
Now you said something to me when I asked you to be on the podcast about you were in Florida, I believe, and meeting with somebody, and that you really love what you're doing now because you can help people that maybe aren't on the bigger scale of before. Tell me a little bit about that, about what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. So, I would categorize the transactions I've been able to work on over now almost 30 years of, kind of put them in silos. One, you've got corporate deals called corporate carve-outs. So, maybe you're selling the whole corporation or you're working with a large corporation to sell off some non-core assets. Then you've got, I would say, private equity-backed deals, and that's where, a CEO entrepreneur, say like yourself, has an investor that they answer to, and investor usually owns the majority of the company. So, you really have, like in representing a seller, I usually have the two clients, right? I've got the investor and also the management team. We're all working together, but they're different people. And then
Right.
the last category, and this is what I'm increasingly doing more of now that I'm getting back to early in my career, I would say are more mom and pops. And these would be, folks that are, entrepreneurs, or they maybe run the business, in the second or third generation. They don't have any outside investors. And so when I'm representing them, it is very personal, and that's exciting. I like that because, in some cases, and I think I was probably referencing this a couple of weeks ago. I sit down with a family, and the business has been growing by the father for over 30 years. And unfortunately, he's come across some health issues. So the family's convinced him it's time to sell. Otherwise, he probably would never sell. um, but when I was able to sit down with the family and say, hey, where I've known them for, I think, 25, 26, 27 years, I was able to say, look, this is what I think we can get out in the marketplace if we move forward. And the reaction was like, really? Like, oh my gosh. And that to me, now, of course, we got to get the deal closed, but
Right.
I'm confident that we will. And that sort of response and reaction to me is really exciting.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's not to take away from when you're, representing a large public company and selling off, say, 200, 300, $400 million worth of assets. That's cool. That's fun also. And
Yeah.
in many cases, that's just a transaction to them. And I get it, right? It's a business transaction. Whereas I think when you're working with smaller companies where the family's involved or the entrepreneur has done well but never really had that sort of life-changing moment of making money, those are cool deals. And I'll kind of I'll give one example of a meaningful one. Is there was a client I worked with, and I've sold assets for them a couple of times. He had me over to his house. And he goes, hey, you see that over there? That was the first sale. And that was like kind of an addition to the house. And then he's like, hey, you see the putting green in back? That was the second sale. And so, he was excited, right? But he was excited to show me and thank me for what I'd helped, him realize in terms of his financial goals. And, I love it that they keep placing the trust in me, right? So it's a cool little symbiotic relationship where, I can help them realize the financial goals. I'm obviously, in a career that I love, or I wouldn't keep doing it. And, yeah, it's been a lot of fun along the way.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love how you broke that down. And, uh, you know, when a family member is not doing well, like the biggest challenge really is those finances and thinking about the future, and to be able to really support them in that way, and in a way to where they're like, ooh,
Yeah,
is got to be very fulfilling.
it's great. It's absolutely great. So yeah, and being able to stay in touch with those folks, they may only have one sale, but in launching my new firm here 6 months ago, people came out of the woodwork that I hadn't talked to in a year. Like, hey, saw this on LinkedIn, congratulations, and being able to circle back and touch base with those folks. We maybe haven't talked to 10 years, 15 years, but they remember the transaction that we worked on because it was very meaningful to them.
Yes. So what does relationship driven leadership actually look like in practice on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, this is a tough one to think about, and as you tell me to think about this ahead of time. I think that the biggest thing I can think of is really leading by example, and I know that's said a lot, but that's probably the first thing that popped to mind. And I say that because, as I'm building out a team, the team that I'm been building out with has not been in my industry for the nearly 30 years that I've been in. Okay, so they're really seeing as they're continuing to work with different clients that I've known for years, they're seeing how it's like, hey, wait a minute, this isn't just again me as Clayton, knowing somebody for like 3 months and then getting hired. They're realizing, hey, wait a minute, this goes back 10 years, 15 years, 20, 25 years. And I think that showing them about, how those have been relationships that I've cultivated and the trust built up over time or the credibility, that I've built up over time with them is really the first thing that pops to mind when I think about how I can be a leader for the team that I'm assembling. And it doesn't, I can say all the different, hey, this is a people business and everything else. But I think to really see it in action
Mm.
and for them to hear that from the clients too is really cool. And I think that's really, it really does sink in with the team. They've mentioned that to me before. So um, yeah,
Mm.
it's really cool to be in a business where it's the same people kind of over and over for 3 decades. I mean, it's one where you don't want to screw up, right? Because it is such a it's a small community, but at the same point, that's I think some of the most rewarding parts.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I like that, leading from the top, leading by example, but also instilling in them that, these are people that you have had relationships for a really long time. And, they need to, I would assume that they need to make sure that they're like loving on them and with, for a lack of better words, like you would.
Yeah, no, and another thing that pops to mind on that one is not only have a lot of the clients been the same when I'm representing them as sellers, but a lot of the buyers, when looking at these transactions, tend to be the same people over and over again. And so, while my job and fiduciary duty is nearly all the time to the seller, you also have to treat the buyer with respect too, because you're dealing with them a lot. So, that's one of the things I've been a really big strength that people will respect how they're treated in a transaction like that, even if they're not the client per se, right? But because
Mm.
ultimately, if I'm representing you, for example, in a sale, and I somehow damage the relationship with some buyers, I may have won the deal for you and you'd be happy and satisfied. But the next client that I work with, because I've burnt that relationship with a potential buyer, they may not then ultimately benefit because that buyer doesn't trust me. And they may not then want to work with me or my firm or my team because they feel like I wasn't upfront with them, or I wasn't, I didn't, I didn't match, my words didn't match, what I was telling them.
Mm.
So that's been a big thing too that I've been really proud of over the years is establishing that relationship with the buyers. Because look, if you're trying to buy a portfolio of towers, for example, there's a lot of people trying to do that too. So you're not going to win every deal, but I think I try to put myself in their shoes. I may not win the deal sometimes, but if I feel like I was treated fairly throughout the entire process, I
Mm.
can feel it takes the sting out of it a little bit, and then we can continue working together.
Yeah, well, you can't win every deal, right?
Nope. Even somebody representing sellers, you have to get comfortable with that too, right? It's like, well,
Yeah.
darn it, I didn't get that deal, and you just kind of move on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So how do leaders maintain strong relationships during difficult conversations or negotiations?
Yeah, I think when I try to put myself in the scenario that you just mentioned, I think it's always coming from a place of authenticity,
Mhm.
uh, openness, and and just not being afraid of delivering what you might think is bad news. I think that that's certainly it's certainly a skill set that I've had to try to develop over time. And I'm not saying it makes it even easier, but sometimes you aren't delivering quote unquote good news. And you have to, I think, separate the fact that it's just news, it's just data, it's not personal. Just because you're the messenger doesn't mean that you're the bad guy. And you might be also be surprised how the person responds. You're making stuff up in your head based on how
Yes.
you might respond. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the how the client's going to respond. So I've learned that over the years too.
Yes, I tell clients all the time, you're making up stories in your head. Stop that.
Exactly. I heard years ago, and I love the phrase, I make up, or, I believe, I take a, say, look, I make up, this is what's happening, whatever. So instead of saying, oh, I know this is going to happen, or I assume
Mm.
it's happening, or whatever, she's saying, hey, this is what I'm making up in my mind. And
Mm.
you and I both know our minds can be our best friends or our greatest enemies.
Yes, I like that, what I'm making up in my mind.
Yep.
That's, I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's a phrase that's worked. I think, pretty well over the years because when you're saying that, you're saying, look, I could be completely wrong, right? So this is what I'm making up in my head, what's going on.
Do you see any common traits in leaders that you admire?
Um, Certainly. I think I look back on like my first and probably best mentor I ever had. He was phenomenal at being able to customize his leadership style individually to those who reported to him.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that that was just one of the very gifted man in many, many, many ways, and I thought that was just a huge gift to try to emulate and copy. So it's a little bit like, we're talking about our kids, right? I mean, might raise them exactly the same way, same house, everything else, but it doesn't matter because they're different people. And that's the same thing in business, right? I mean, if you've got five people reporting to you, you can't, I don't believe a good leader has the same style when directly interacting with all five people. You can probably have an overarching and governing way that you lead, so for example, by example, or with authenticity, or however you want to describe it as your overall leadership style. But I think if you're ultimately leading individuals as well, you have to understand, kind of gets back to what you're saying, understand who they are, be a good listener, and that way you can customize your leadership style to what's ultimately going to benefit them, but also benefit yourself as you're trying to accomplish your goals and objectives.
And I think with our kids too, as we grow on this journey, they also, like, as much as we want to think that we're giving them the same parent, we grow. That oldest, they
Yeah.
get the harder times, the harder things when we're not as experienced, and then the younger one maybe gets a little more of that benefit of
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. Yes. 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 Yes.
So what has fatherhood taught you about leadership?
Oh, good golly. I with the benefit now of time and hindsight, kids are watching everything that you're doing and they're seeing if it matches what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
That can be such, I think, a tough line to follow. So for example, if you're, this is not a personal thing, but certainly or my kids might say it's a personal thing. So let's just say, I make up that my kids would give an example of this, that, I can try to talk about um, prioritizing family and friends, but then they might be able to look at me and say, yeah, but dad, you're working all the time. And they're not wrong, but I may be able to say, yeah, but I work all the time to then provide for then those free times that I can spend with friends and family. So, you know, but they're watching all the time and the like. And I've gotten that feedback now as my kids have gotten older. They would say, hey, you were gone a lot, when we were younger. You were working a lot when we were younger, and we remember that. We also see that you're still doing that now, and we understand why, because we understand that's what it's going to take for us to try to hopefully be successful in our careers too. So, you know, and again, I like to joke, and everybody I'm sure has heard this cliche. It's the one job you have no idea if you're doing a good job or not until it's too late, right? There's no manual on how to be a parent, no matter how many freaking books there are out there and how many things we can attend, right? It's we're all just trying to do our best. So, I think that, kind of circle back directly to your question, I just think it's realizing that, you have to, I think, be consistent in your living with the kids because they'll notice the inconsistencies.
Yes. And I can definitely relate. There was a time, after, my husband passed that, I was working a lot because it's a lot of pressure. And I was seeing the effects that it was having on my kids, especially my daughter. Because she would talk about it. She'd
Yeah,
be like,
yeah, they call you out on it,
oh,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
So then I had to, take a season to where, I shifted. And that's really a big part of why I started my own company, is so that I could be home more and not be out and gone and doing all the things that it takes to be a successful mortgage lender, to be there for them. And you will never regret that time that you spent with them.
No, absolutely not. Yes, I was on a guy's trip this past weekend, and was talking to some of the guys who are a lot younger than I am, and maybe they're on their first kiddo, or they have two kiddos, both under the age of 5, and I'm just like, look and enjoy it as much as you can. I know it's brutal right now. We remember those days, but
Yes.
but enjoy as much of that time as possible because you will blink and it'll be gone, and you'll sit there and be like, man, I wish I would have been more present or been there more, and even if I think you approach it that way, it still flies by. You know?
Yes. Yes. It goes so much faster than you can ever have imagined that it would. And when you are in the times, the really hard, messy times, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this? You just do.
Yeah, you just do. You just power through because there's really, I mean, there's other alternatives, but they're not good alternatives. So you just
Right.
continue to power through and do your best.
And something that you said, like your kids are watching you. I think in leadership, your team is also watching you. So
Oh,
making sure that you're also being authentic, doing what you say, saying what you mean, doing following whatever. I'm paraphrasing in a not the exact way there either, but you get the gist.
yeah.
And I think that with them, it can be a game changer for your business if you're not being authentic and you know, doing what you expect them to do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think about this example a lot, and this is what I've told my team when having recruiting them, having them come on board, and the like. There's a joke in investment banking, especially at the big bank level, the Wall Street level, that the managing director, the head of the deal or whatever, will say, "Hey, I need this by tomorrow." They get it by tomorrow, and then they don't reply for 1 or 2 or 3 days.
Mm,
And I know that that can be really disheartening. And, I try, my best, certainly not perfect, but try my best to be responsive and also respectful of the time that somebody else is taking to get me a deliverable. So, I think that that's certainly one thing that pops to mind. Leading by example is,
mhm.
in my profession, we work a lot of hours, and there's a lot of timeline deadlines and tight timelines, et cetera, and being respectful if somebody's working till midnight, 1, 2 in the morning on something, that you try to be responsive as quickly as possible because they invested their time in getting it to you.
Yeah, and what comes to me is like a lot of times we want things, we're an instant gratification society,
Oh,
but
yeah.
some behavioral styles do their best work when they have just a little additional time. How do
Yep.
you manage that?
Yeah, I think it's situational, and totally agree with you. I mean, there's a certain point where you're right. I think some people are wired. They like that sort of adrenaline rush where they're waiting last minute and everything else.
Yeah.
I've tried with my team. If we know we have a meeting a month from now, let's not start the work product a week before the meeting. We've got a month. Let's just slowly be working towards it and everything else versus trying to cram it. And there's always going to be the cramming, but
Yeah.
at the same point, if you've got lead time, take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's also an important point.
Yeah, just budget your time and plan and take advantage of it.
So, as a father and a founder now, how has your perspective on relationships and leadership evolved over time?
Yeah, I think it's only solidified to some of the things we talked about earlier, that it is all about relationships, whether it's your relationship with your kids and being able to relate to them, your relationship with your clients, your relationship with, as mentioned, the other people on the other side of the table, where again,
Mhm.
they're technically not my clients, but I have to be respectful of them and their time and their efforts because I'm going to keep going back to them over and over again with multiple opportunities for them to acquire transactions from my clients. So it does just further solidify again it is all about interpersonal interactions and gaining that trust and not breaking that trust.
Mm.
And because that can be so difficult to try to repair, as you and I both know, right? There's always instances we can look back on and be like, yeah, I didn't handle that well, or yeah, that trust was broken because I wasn't authentic in what I was doing or saying or didn't follow through, and just trying to keep it top of mind that try to avoid that as much as possible.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, because trust. takes time to build, even though some people they think that they trust more instantly, but really trust takes time to build, but it does not take any time to break.
No, that's very true. Very
So for leaders listening today, what's one shift that they can make immediately to strengthen relationships and elevate their leadership?
I've had, sort of this is, as I mentioned before, the benefit of really of working with people over and over again for years.
Hmm.
And I have found that to strengthen relationships is to get really, and I've used this word a lot before, but just authentic. And,
Hmm.
it is talking about real life stuff to the extent that the other person's comfortable, right? You got to read the room a little bit, right? Not
Right.
everyone's going to be comfortable talking about what's going on with them or and the like. But I know that as, for example, my kids have gotten older and left the house, being able to talk about what that's like, what that feeling is like with friends who are clients of mine who are in that same situation. And I
Mm.
think, once you talk about real life stuff like that, the business stuff kind of comes naturally, if that makes any sense.
Mm.
Another thing that I've had the gift and benefit of is being the founder of a firm, is I do go to my clients who are entrepreneurs like myself and ask them for lessons, ask them for suggestions. And, not about my business per se, because we have very different businesses, but as a leader of an organization, as, a leader of people who have trusted you to, provide them with a job, a career. So having, those are conversations, again, not everybody's going to be comfortable having.
Mhm.
And it's probably more situational, but I've realized that having those just real non-business slash interpersonal questions, conversations, whatever, lead to deeper relationships. And it can be a variety of topics, right? It could be like the difficulty of raising kids. It could be the challenges of an organization. It could be, you may, in your situation, Tammy, you may, find that a commonality in somebody who's also been a widow. In my background, it's somebody who's also been divorced.
Right.
And, being able to have those are life-changing experiences,
Mhm.
and being able then to have that ability to talk with somebody else who's been there and can relate. I remember one meeting I had, probably 4 or 5 years ago, and I'd been about divorced 5 years at that point, and I go sit down with a client, and the client's getting divorced. And we spent 45 minutes talking about what that's like and how that was making him feel, and him
Mhm.
asking for advice and me giving whatever advice I had. And then it was 10 minutes talking business. And I was recently with that same CEO, and he reminded me of that. He goes, "Yeah, I remember we just sat there and pretty talked about life." And I think that makes a huge difference in a relationship when you can do that.
Yeah. So what I hear you say is authenticity, vulnerability,
Yeah,
and then
yeah, yeah.
asking for somebody else's perspective from time to time.
Yeah, it's almost like, if you're willing to show people that you're willing to meet them somewhere a little bit closer in a interaction versus just a arm's length, if that makes any sense.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
again, that's not comfortable for everybody. I completely respect that too. And those who are willing to be like, hey, I'll start meeting you a little bit closer than that. Those have been some really rich relationships.
Yeah, I think that vulnerability isn't something that, as a society, we've been really good at, but I definitely think that it's something that we are going towards,
Yep.
that authenticity, and being like admitting, like, hey, I didn't always have it all figured out, but
Yeah.
I have always been working to grow.
Yeah. And what your opinion on this one too? I feel like it's more difficult for people to probably do that in their 20s and 30s earlier on in their career versus as you cross a certain threshold. And maybe it's over 50, I don't know, right? But there seems to be a certain age where I think people are more comfortable saying, you know what, I realize I don't have all the answers, but
Yeah.
I'm willing to work with somebody who will help me get the answers, or I'm willing to look at somebody and work with somebody who's smarter than I am because I can't figure this out. And man, I don't know about you, Tammy, I found that so difficult to do when you're expected to be this expert or know what you're doing when you come out of school. And you and I can laugh in hindsight. You don't know what you're doing at 22, 23, 24. But it's
No.
difficult, I think, for people at that age to be vulnerable and ask for help. But I think that's a life skill that I wish I would have learned a lot earlier than I did.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that for a long time, I thought intimacy was different than it is, more
Mhm.
of the, but when you create a safe space for people to feel valued and heard, then you're actually bringing up additional leaders during that time.
Yeah, yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think, I think of examples in the past when, I'm working with somebody and let's say we're on the same team, right? But it's a junior person. If they're saying, "Hey, I don't understand. Can you help me?" I'm more than happy to jump in,
Hmm.
because I'd rather them say, "Hey, I don't understand." Either I understand what you're telling me, which obviously communication's a two-way street, so I could completely be the one with terrible communication.
Yes.
Um, but being able to jump in and help that person when they ask for help, is well, I like to feel like if you're a good leader, you're listening to what they're asking you to do and you're being responsive instead of saying, "Oh, I'm not going to help you," or ignoring them or even chastising them.
Mm.
If they're truly saying, "Hey, I'm asking for your help, will you please help me?"
Yes, yes, I do see that sometimes where people are chastising or, even talking not in not good ways about their team members behind their backs. And
Yep.
it just gives me the ick.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So, what does unleash your amazing leadership mean to you?
A goal that probably never really is attained, and I say that because I I don't think we ever really get it, we define it, as perfect, or we figure it out,
Mhm.
constantly figuring it out as we go. And, I think being able to figure out what your strengths are and soar with your strengths is something that we're always kind of evolving into. So, I'm a big believer everybody's got whatever potential they have as long as they're willing to make the choices to live up to their full potential.
Mm.
And being able to embrace that and realize that you can do it, that are the only one really stopping you, uh,
Mm.
is that's what kind of brings up to me. When
Yeah. I think that sometimes it can be challenging to know what your strengths are. I mean, that's a lot of the work that I do with people is helping them understand their strengths and lean more into that. But a lot of times people don't understand it. They've been taught or told like this is how you have success. But I feel like success is different for each person. We're so individual that nothing is cookie cutter like we were taught.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, my advice to my kids, and I've developed this, certainly on my own, but it's been watching other very successful people, and how would I say it, and people that are really content with where they are in their lives, because
Mm.
success can be wildly different, right? For somebody, it's title. For somebody, it's how many degrees they can get. For some people, it's measured by monetary. Okay, but I've said that if you can live life with three sort of ways. One is be a good person to others, live life with gratitude, and
Mm.
lastly, you work your tail off. Because I think there's no real secret to it, right? And I think if you combine those three, then you're going to be able to do whatever you want to do. And I say that again, you may not get the title that you want over here, but when you don't get that, another door opens over here that could be even better than what you imagined. But as long as you're living life with a lot of gratitude, as long as you're just being a good person to others, and as long as you just keep your head down and grind and grind and grind, that's where I've seen people be successful. And it's just a matter of, do you want to do it or not? And that's why it comes back to unleash your amazing is, everybody has the ability to do that. It's just that they want to do it or not. And we've seen it where some people just don't want to do it, and that's okay. You know,
Yes, their amazing looks different than yours or mine. And
absolutely.
yeah, well, something that comes to me with what you said is I worked with a coach whenever I was, in some of the darker times of my life. And she said to me that you need to let it be easy. And like I tried to do that for a long time, but it's just not. Like
Yeah,
life
I
is
know.
just not easy. And
No.
the more I try to make it easy, the harder it got. So I think it's that like working hard, it's having a good work ethic, being kind, being a good person, but also being grateful for the journey. I was talking to a client yesterday and I was like, telling her about starting to journal and, when you have a hard day, just like brain dumping all the stuff that's happened, but then finding, okay, where are the lessons here?
Yeah.
Where how am I grateful for this experience? Like, what can I take from it that will help me in the future? And I don't think that people practice enough gratitude. So I really love that.
No, I agree, and I think that that leads to, there's, just a personal philosophy. People are like, oh, you got to be happy and whatever, and I think happiness is a temporary emotion, just as sadness is a temporary emotion. Okay, and
Yes.
just like, you're not always going to be happy and you're not always going to be sad. You just realize you transition through these different things.
Mm.
I do believe, however, that you can be content while riding the ups and the downs, right? You can look back, and for me, as contentment is, coming from a place perhaps of tapping into that gratitude, right? It's when things are on the high, you're grateful for the good times. When things are at their lowest, you're grateful for the bad times because one, you're learning something from it. You may not be obvious what you're learning from it at the moment, but you just have to trust that you're learning something. And then you also realize that's temporary. And
Yes.
just learning to sit in it and be like, all right, this is all temporary. And again, I know that comes from the benefit of getting older and having more life experience, but man, the sooner somebody I think can figure that out, the more life is a lot easier, you
Yeah.
know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing your time with me today. I really appreciate it. If people wanted to get in touch with you, how could they connect?
Yeah, certainly. No, under Clayton Funk on LinkedIn. If you, I think you have to narrow it down because there's a few other Clayton Funks shockingly around the country.
Interesting.
I think if you do like for Clearwater Beach or whatever where my firm is based, I'll pop up or Clayton Funk and then my firm Signal Strength Advisors. Best way to track me down to LinkedIn. And I think I've got my contact information on there, or try to contact you from my firm's website, which I wish it was a shorter URL, but it is what it is, signalstrengthadvisors.com.
I love it. Well, thank you again for sharing your time with me today. I always enjoy our conversations.
Likewise. Thanks, Tammy. I appreciate it.